I'm Nora, I'm 37, and at my sister's engagement dinner, my mother raised her champagne glass toward the crystal chandelier, looked at my 14-year-old daughter Maya, and thanked God the girl hadn't inherited my damaged blood. She said it smiling, her voice carrying that particular lilt she used for compliments that were actually autopsies. The room laughed. 40 people in cocktail attire, tilting their heads, murmuring about how brave my mother was to have raised someone like me. Nobody saw Maya's face. The way her fork froze halfway to her mouth. The way she looked at me not with confusion, but with a dawning, terrible understanding that adults could wound you in public and serve dessert afterward. I saw it, and that was the last time I ever let them see either of us. But that was the end, or near it. To understand why I didn't scream, why I didn't flip the table or throw my wine in her face, you have to understand what came before. You have to understand the math of my childhood, which was never about love, but about inventory. About who was broken and who was sellable. I was 8 when they told me I was sick. My mother took me to Dr. Harrow, a man who smelled like peppermint and old leather, who ran tests in an office that looked more like a bank than a clinic. I remember the lights, too bright. I remember him pressing cold instruments to my temples while my mother sat in the corner with her hands folded like she was praying, though I know now she was simply performing grief. The diagnosis was epilepsy. Juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, to be precise. A sentence wrapped in Latin that, to an 8-year-old, simply meant, you are dangerous. You are fragile. You are the reason we cannot go to the beach, cannot fly to see grandma, cannot have a normal life. My sister Chloe was 6 then. She was already in ballet. She had a tutu the color of pink lemonade and a recital schedule that covered our mother's refrigerator. I had a pill organizer. 7 compartments, 4 colors, a routine that required me to swallow before breakfast, after lunch, before bed. The medication made me slow, foggy. I would sit in class and feel my thoughts move like fish in murky water, visible but unreachable. My teachers called me spacey. My mother called me her little burden, always with a sigh that suggested she was carrying something heavier than God intended. What I didn't know then, what I only discovered 6 months ago, was that Dr. Harrow was my father's college roommate. That there was no epilepsy. That the EEGs were misread, or more likely, never read at all. That the pills they fed me were anticonvulsants strong enough to sedate a horse, given to a child who had nothing more than stress-induced migraines and a mother who needed a patient. Because a sick daughter generated sympathy, generated insurance checks, generated a perfect foil for Chloe, who could shine only if someone else was dimmed by design. By the time I was 12, I was a ghost in my own body. I slept 10 hours and woke exhausted. I gained weight from the medications, while Chloe grew lean and graceful. I had no friends because my mother told their mothers I was unpredictable, a word that made sleepovers impossible. I spent my Saturdays in waiting rooms while Chloe spent hers on stages, receiving flowers, being told she was extraordinary, and I believed it. I believed I was the broken tile in the mosaic, the necessary flaw that made the rest of the picture beautiful. At 16, I met Daniel. He was 19, worked at the garage where my father took the car, and he looked at me like I was already whole. It was the first time anyone had. My mother hated him instantly, not because he was dangerous, but because he saw me. When I came home late one October night, smiling for the first time in years, she didn't ask where I'd been. She emptied my purse onto the kitchen table and found the condom I'd bought at the pharmacy, my hands shaking, my face burning with the shame of needing protection against a world that had always felt unsafe. 2 months later, I was pregnant. I remember the kitchen. The same kitchen where Chloe had baked her first soufflé at 13 while I watched from the corner, too drugged to trust myself near the oven. My mother stood at the sink, her back to me, her shoulders rigid. My father sat at the table, a man who communicated primarily through silence and the occasional verdict. I had just said the words, "I'm pregnant." My mother turned. Her face was not angry, it was worse, it was relieved. I saw it in the loosening of her jaw, the way her eyes brightened with something that looked like opportunity. "Well," she said, "at least we know what's wrong with you now, at least it's not your brain." They didn't ask what I wanted. They didn't ask about Daniel, who had already left town after my mother threatened to report him for statutory relations if he came near me again. They made the arrangements within a week. A private adoption, they called it. A loving family who couldn't conceive. I was sent to a facility 2 towns over where I shared a room with 3 other girls, all of us swelling with shame, while nurses checked our vitals, and reminded us we were giving a gift. I gave birth on a Tuesday in March. I was 17. They didn't let me hold him. I heard him cry once, a thin, outraged sound, and then he was gone. A nurse injected something into my Roman 4, and when I woke, my breasts ached with milk that would never be used, and my son had a new last name I would not be allowed to know. My mother visited the next day with a bouquet of white lilies, the flower of funerals, and patted my hand. "You did the right thing," she said. "Chloe's applying to Juilliard next year. We can't have distractions." I found out years later, through a letter that arrived last winter, forwarded 3 times, the envelope thin and trembling in my hands, that there was no loving family, that my parents had been paid $40,000 by a broker, that my son had entered the foster system at 3 days old and had spent the next 18 years bouncing between homes that didn't keep him, that the adoption had been a transaction, and I had been the merchandise. My mother had deposited the money the same afternoon I was discharged, splitting it with my father to pay off the mortgage on this house, the house where Chloe's engagement party would later be held, where my mother would toast to my damaged blood while standing on floors my tragedy had paid for. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I left home at 18 with a garbage bag of clothes and the withdrawal tremors from medications I'd been forced to take for a disease I never had. I worked graveyard shifts at a diner, where the regulars called me sweetheart, and left tips that smelled like cigarettes and pity. I got my GED in a library basement. I met David when I was 24, at a community college biology lecture I was taking to become a certified nursing assistant. He sat next to me and noticed that I flinched when the fluorescent lights buzzed. He didn't ask why, he just moved his notebook to block the glare. We were married within a year. He was gentle in a way that made me weep, because gentleness had always been something I had to earn. Maya was born when I was 23. She came out screaming, red-faced, furious, and the moment they placed her on my chest, I understood what my mother had stolen from me. Not just my son, but the knowledge that I was capable of this, of creating something perfect, of being a harbor instead of a shipwreck. David held my hand and said, "She's got your eyes," and I cried for 3 hours because nobody had ever wanted my eyes before. We built a life. Small, careful hours. I became an LPN, then an RN. David worked in construction. We bought a house with a porch that needed painting and a yard where Maya grew tomatoes that never ripened properly but that she insisted tasted like sunlight. I sent birthday cards to my parents every year. They went unanswered. I called on Christmas. My mother would pass the phone to Chloe within 30 seconds. I told myself I was being the bigger person. I told myself that families were complicated, that forgiveness was a muscle, that if I just kept showing up, eventually they would see me. Hope is a strange tax. You keep paying it even when the returns are garbage. Then last winter the letter came. It wasn't from my parents. It was from a social worker in Albany named Patricia Hume, who had been trying to find me for 2 years. She wrote that my son, my biological son, the one I'd been told was living with a loving family in Connecticut, had aged out of the foster system. He had my eyes, she said. He had asked about me, and in the process of locating me, Miss Hume had uncovered irregularities in the adoption file. A payment. A signature that looked like my mother's but wasn't mine. A private arrangement that had never gone through proper legal channels. I read that letter at my kitchen table while Maya was at school and David was at a job site. I read it 11 times. Then I called in sick to work, drove to the medical records archive in the county where I'd grown up, and requested every file Dr. Harrow had ever kept on me. It took 3 weeks and a HIPAA appeal and a threat involving a malpractice attorney David knew from his union, but I got them. The EEG from when I was 8, normal, the blood work, normal, the MRI, normal. Every single test, annotated in handwriting I didn't recognize, with the word unremarkable stamped across the top like a verdict. I took them to a neurologist in the city, a woman named Dr. Alina Voss who specialized in pediatric misdiagnosis. She looked at the scans for 40 seconds before she said, "This child never had epilepsy. These are the records of a healthy, stressed, probably sleep-deprived little girl. The medication they gave you would have caused the exact symptoms they claimed to treat. The weight gain, the fog, the fatigue." She paused. "Your parents filed insurance claims for 11 years. Do you know how much they collected?" I didn't, but I found out. $187,000. Enough for Chloe's private lessons, her summer intensives in New York, the car she got at 16. Enough for the down payment on my parents' house. My illness had been their investment portfolio. I hired a private investigator. I found the bank records. The $40,000 from the adoption agency, which was actually a lawyer who specialized in private placements for desperate couples. I found my son's foster records, the group homes, the emergency placements, the note from a therapist who wrote that he struggles with attachment but shows remarkable resilience. His name was Ethan. He was 21. He had my eyes. I didn't tell my parents any of this. Not yet. I wanted to see if they would ever, on their own, become something other than the people who had sold my child and poisoned my childhood. I wanted to test the same hope I'd been paying into for decades, one last time. Chloe's engagement dinner was in May. She was marrying a man named Richard who worked in private equity and pronounced summer as if it had 3 syllables. My mother called me 3 weeks before, her voice carrying that same performance of warmth she used at church. "We'd love for you to be there, Nora. Family should celebrate together. And Meyer is getting so big. It would mean so much to Chloe." It meant nothing to Chloe. We hadn't spoken in 2 years, not since she told me at Thanksgiving that my obsession with my health was exhausting for everyone. But I said yes. I bought Meyer a dress the color of sage green. I told myself we were going to show them what we'd built. I told myself that maybe, surrounded by joy, my mother would look at my daughter and see something worth loving. The venue was my parents' house. The same house. The mortgage on it had been paid with my son's absence and my fall sickness. They'd renovated since I'd last been there. The walls were now gray instead of beige. The kitchen had marble countertops where my mother had once emptied my purse, and the backyard had been landscaped into something that looked like a magazine spread. 40 guests milled about with champagne flutes, people I'd never met, Chloe's friends from her Pilate studio, and Richard's colleagues from the firm. We arrived at 7. Maya held my hand. She was nervous. She'd only met my parents twice, both times brief and cold. She kept smoothing her dress, a habit she'd picked up from me, this need to check that we were presentable before entering spaces where we were not wanted. My mother greeted us at the door. She hugged Chloe first, even though Chloe lived there and had seen her that morning. Then she turned to me. Her eyes moved over my dress. A simple navy sheath I'd bought on sale, over my shoes, over my hair, which I'd cut myself because salon appointments felt like luxuries I didn't deserve. "Nora," she said, "you look rested." It was not a compliment, it was an accusation, as if rest were something I hadn't earned. She didn't hug Maya. She patted her shoulder and said, "Let's find you a seat at the children's table, sweetheart. The adults are going to toast." Maya was 14. She was not a child. But my mother had already turned, already guiding a guest toward the bar, already dismissing us with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades practicing indifference. We sat at a table near the kitchen. I could smell the catering, something with truffle oil and herbs. Maya picked at a bread roll. "Mom," she whispered, "why does Grandma look at me like I'm a stranger?" "Because she doesn't know how to look at people she loves," I said. "It's not your fault. Does she love you?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Not because it was cruel, but because it was innocent. Because Maya still believed that love was the default setting of grandmothers, and she was trying to calibrate what she saw against what she knew should be true. "She loves me in her way," I lied. The dinner was served in courses, each one announced by my mother as if she'd prepared it herself, though I could see the catering staff in black uniforms hovering near the kitchen. Richard stood up to give a speech about Chloe. He called her his muse, his anchor, his reason for believing in something larger than quarterly returns. Everyone laughed. Chloe cried perfect tears. My mother wept openly, dabbing her eyes with a napkin that probably cost more than my scrubs. Then my father stood. He was thinner than I remembered, his suit hanging off shoulders that had once seemed broad enough to carry verdicts. He raised his glass. "To Chloe," he said, "the daughter who never gave us a moment's worry." The room applauded. I applauded too because the alternative was screaming, because I had given them worry, hadn't I? The epilepsy that wasn't, the pregnancy that was, the silence that followed me out of the house and into a life they never asked about. My mother took the glass from my father's hand. She raised it higher. She looked directly at me, or maybe past me at the guests who were watching. "And thank God," she said, her voice ringing clear and bright, "that Maya didn't inherit Nora's damaged blood. Can you imagine another generation of that strain? We are so blessed." The room laughed, not everyone, but enough. A low, rolling chuckle that moved through the guests like a wave, people who didn't know me, who assumed this was a family joke. A playful teasing between women who shared history, They didn't know that damaged blood meant a childhood of unnecessary drugs. They didn't know it meant a son sold for $40,000. They didn't know that my mother was not joking. She was testifying. I looked at Maya. She wasn't crying. She was staring at her grandmother with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. It wasn't hurt. It was recognition. The same recognition I'd had at 8, at 12. At 17, when I realized that the people who were supposed to love me had drawn a border around my value and declared it a restricted zone. Something broke in me then. Not loudly, not with the shattering of glass or the overturning of tables. Something quieter. A wall I'd built out of birthday cards and unanswered phone calls, and the belief that if I just kept showing up they would finally open the door. It crumbled. And behind it was not grief. Was not rage. Was a cold, clear space where I could finally think. I stood up. My chair scraped against the floor, loud in the sudden quiet that followed my mother's toast. 40 faces turned toward me. My mother's smile faltered just slightly. She hadn't expected a response. She'd expected the same 3 reactions I'd given her for 37 years: tears, silence, or the door. "Mom," I said. My voice was steady. I had practiced steadiness my entire life. It was the one thing they'd given me, even if they hadn't meant to. "Do you remember Dr. Harrow?" She blinked. "What, Dr. Harrow, your husband's college roommate, the man who diagnosed me with epilepsy when I was 8, the man who prescribed phenobarbital and valproic acid to a child who had normal brain scans." The room went still. Richard lowered his glass. Chloe's perfect tears dried on her cheeks. "I have the records," I continued. I reached into my purse. Not the one she'd emptied 16 years ago, but a leather bag David had bought me for my birthday, and withdrew a manila envelope. Every EEG, every MRI, every blood panel, all unremarkable, all normal. 11 years of medication that made me a ghost, and I was never sick. But you knew that. Because you and Dad collected $187,000 in insurance claims, because sick daughters are profitable. Father's face went gray. My mother's hand tightened on her champagne flute until I thought it might crack. "That's not," my mother started. "And the pregnancy," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room was so quiet I could hear the ice melting in someone's glass. "When I was 17, you told me it was a closed adoption, a loving family. You sent me to that place and you told me I was giving a gift." I pulled another document from the envelope, a copy of a bank statement obtained through the investigator. "This is a deposit slip, $40,000, made by you the day after I gave birth, paid by a lawyer named Saul Krennick who brokered private adoptions for cash. There was no loving family, Mom. My son went into foster care, he aged out, he has my eyes, and you used the money to pay off this house." Maya made a sound, small, wounded. I didn't look at her. I couldn't, not yet. "Nora," my father said, his voice was hoarse. "You don't understand the context. We were trying to protect." "Protect who?" I asked. "Chloe, she got Juilliard. She got summers in Italy. She got this house, this life, this party where you toast her perfection while you call your other daughter's blood damaged." I looked at Chloe. She was staring at me with an expression that wasn't guilt. It was calculation. She was already trying to figure out how to spin this, how to make it about my instability, my history. "I didn't know," Chloe said. Her voice was small, practiced. "Nora, I swear I didn't know about the money." "You knew I was the scapegoat," I said. "You knew every time you got a new costume, a new trip, a new car that I was sleeping off medication I didn't need. You didn't ask why, you didn't care why, and tonight you let her say that about my daughter, your niece, and you smiled." I turned back to my mother. She was shaking her head, small, rapid movements, denial as reflex. "You're ill," she whispered. "You're having an episode, you need to sit down." "I'm not ill," I said. "I never was, and I have the records to prove it. I also have a meeting next week with the State Insurance Fraud Bureau and with a family law attorney who specializes in illegal adoption practices. I'm not here to ruin your night, Mom. I'm here to tell you that the story you told about me, the broken one, the burden, the mistake, is over. I'm not broken. I was never broken. I was just surrounded by people who needed me to be." I folded the documents, put them back in my bag, then I walked around the table to Maya. She was standing now, her face wet with tears she hadn't made a sound to produce. I took her hand. It was cold. "One more thing," I said, turning at the edge of the room. My mother's guests were frozen, some already reaching for their phones, whether to record or to call someone I didn't know. "My son, Ethan, he found me. He wants to meet his sister. And when he does, I'm going to tell him that the family who sold him called themselves loving. I'm going to tell him that the only thing damaged in this bloodline is the capacity for shame. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. I led Maya through the kitchen, past the catering staff who had heard everything, out the back door into the night air that smelled like jasmine and freedom. She didn't speak until we were in the car, until I'd buckled her seatbelt and started the engine and driven 3 blocks away from the house that my sickness had paid for. "Mom," she said. Her voice was thick. "You have a son?" "I do," I said. "His name is Ethan, he's 21, and he's going to love you." "And Grandma, she really did that." "She did." Maya was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached over and put her hand on mine where it gripped the steering wheel. "I'm glad we're not going back," she said. "I drove us home." David was waiting on the porch, though he didn't know about the dinner, didn't know about the toast, didn't know that his wife had finally stopped paying a tax on hope that had bankrupted her for decades. He just saw our faces and opened his arms. Maya went to him first. Then I did. And for the first time in my life, I let someone else hold the weight. The calls started that night. My mother's voicemail at 11:03 p.m., not crying but furious, structured, managing the narrative even in defeat. "How dare you humiliate us? In front of Richard's parents, in front of the Whitmores. You have always been unstable, Nora, this proves it." She didn't apologize, she accused. "My father called once, left no message. Chloe sent a text. Asterisk, you're going to regret this. We have lawyers too. Asterisk, I didn't answer any of them. Not yet." I needed them to sit in the rubble of the story they'd built, to feel the foundation shift beneath their feet, to understand that the scapegoat had learned to read blueprints and was now holding the demolition permit. On the 6th day, I called Ethan. We'd been writing for months, careful letters, building a bridge across a canyon that wasn't our fault. He answered on the 2nd ring. "Hey Nora," he said. He called me Nora, not Mom. We were still learning each other. I told them, I said. He was quiet. Then, "How did it feel?" "Like finally breathing out," I said. "After 37 years of holding my breath." He laughed, a sound that was my father's in timbre but mine in its warmth. "I've got a bus ticket for next weekend," he said, "if the offer to meet still stands." "It stands," I said. "You have a sister who needs to know she's not damaged, and a brother-in-law who makes pancakes that'll ruin you for all other pancakes." "I'll take it," he said. I hung up. Maya was in the kitchen making tea with the concentration she applied to everything. She looked up when I entered. "Is he coming?" "Next weekend." She nodded. Then she did something that broke and healed me simultaneously. She walked over, opened my purse, and took out the manila envelope. She didn't open it, she just held it. "You kept the proof," she said. "I did. Good, because if they ever forget, we'll remind them." I looked at my daughter, this girl who was not damaged, who was not broken, who had inherited nothing from my mother's cruelty except the opportunity to witness its defeat, and I realized that the family I was building was not the one I'd been born into. It was the one I had chosen. The one I had fought for. The one where love was not a tax, but a gift, freely given, never begged. That's my story. If someone ever made you feel like your blood was damaged, like your presence was a burden, like your pain was their profit, hear me. You were never the broken one. You were the one who survived the breaking, and that makes you stronger than any lie they ever told.